Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's really because it's really only in the last year or two that I began hearing the words public history. And I feel grateful to be hearing them because now at last I know what to call myself. All my life I've always felt uncomfortable when people introduce me as a historian because I don't have a degree in history, I don't teach in a history department, but now I feel a little bit like that character in Molière who was thrilled to discover that he'd been speaking prose all his life. I can say I'm a practitioner of public history. I thought that I would talk about a couple of my experiences in doing this, and I find that they all revolve basically around the same theme, which is this. When I was a high school student, and even a college student, I always thought of history as something immutable, unchangeable. It was there in the past, it was a bunch of things that had happened, and the job of a historian was to know what had happened in the past, understand what had happened in the past. A good historian knew more and understood more. But the longer that I've worked with this kind of material, the more I've gotten fascinated by the way that the way we remember history, the way a country remembers something that happened, or a group of countries remembers something that happened 200 years in the past, today, is very different from the way people remembered exactly the same thing 50 years after it happened, or 100 years after it happened. And those changes take place not because of changing fashions in the academic world. They certainly don't take place because vast new amounts of information have been discovered that nobody knew about before. They take place because of changes in the world that we live in today. In the world of politics, of public events, new groups of people gain rights or gain power that they didn't have before and force us to look at history differently. I think I first started thinking about this when I noticed how different was the American history my children were learning in high school than the American history I'd studied in high school. When I went to high school in the 1950s, I learned that there had been slavery in the United States, but it was mainly important because it was a cause of the American Civil War. I never read a slave narrative. I never read anything that I can remember about what daily life was like for a slave in the United States, daily life on a plantation. But when my children went to school in the 1980s, they learned who Frederick Douglass was, they read slave narratives, they learned a great deal about the daily life of slaves, and this change was due, of course, to the fact that this country went through some extraordinary upheavals in the 1950s and 60s involving the civil rights movement. So that began to make me interested in seeing how this process of looking at the past differently has happened in other times and places as well. So let me take you through a couple of those places. I want to begin by talking about Russia. Because I think there has never been a more spectacular example of tight control for a long period of time of how history was supposed to be looked at. From the 1920s through the 1980s in the Soviet Union, there was a very particular way that you were supposed to look at the past. It was supposed to show the glories of communism, the vast problems with everything else, and in addition to that, during the Stalin era particularly, there were constant changes as particular people in the communist firmament suddenly became non-persons, became executed, fell out of favor, and several times a year, librarians all over the Soviet Union received new pages that were to be inserted in the great Soviet encyclopedia, this 36-volume compendium of knowledge, in place of other pages that were to be torn out and destroyed. And the joke in Soviet days, when you spoke with people about history or spoke with people who were hoping or trying to study history, was you never know what's going to happen yesterday. When I first started going to Russia as a journalist, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, I was always fascinated by the discrepancies between what people would tell you in private, what they would talk about over the family dinner table, when they would often, you know, if they trusted you, they would talk about a grandfather or an uncle or somebody who had been sent to Siberia or shot during the 1930s, and what was spoken about publicly in museums, in school textbooks, in the other ways, in the newspapers, in the way that history was officially looked at, where there was never any mention of the fact that this country really went through a sort of self-inflicted genocide during the 25 years or so when Stalin was dictator, in which the best estimates today are that somewhere around 18 or 20 million Soviets met unnatural deaths, either dying in man-made famines or in the far-flung camps of the Gulag or being shot by firing squads. This was never mentioned. If you looked at that great Soviet encyclopedia, which was in use right up through the end of the 1980s, 36 volumes, look up the biographical entry on Joseph Stalin, very short, only a page and a half, with just a sort of bare bones listing of posts held and dates that he's held them, and a passing remark, certain of his character traits had negative repercussions. So I was always fascinated by this tremendous discrepancy between this horror show that so much of Soviet history had been, which was so widely known, and the fact that people could not openly, you know, in a public way, speak about this. Then, of course, Gorbachev came to power in the mid-1980s, and by the late 1980s, it was suddenly clear that enormous changes were in the works, and the one that interested me the most was it now became possible to write and speak openly about the past, not in Russia, not just over the family dinner table, but in lecture halls, on the radio, in newspapers, in history books.